Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello insan muda. I'm Anindya Kirana as your host for today's special episode of Humanitalk podcast. How are you guys? I hope you are okay, particularly during fasting and stay healthy because we're still in the middle of the pandemic. During this special month, I want to invite you to collaborate with Dompet Dhuafa to share your kindness with unfortunate people. You can do it by scanning your QR code on your screen or transferring it to the below account number. As you've probably known that Indonesia holds the presidency of the Group of 20 or G20. What is G20? G20 is an informal intergovernmental multilateral forum comprised of 20 world's largest economies that meet regularly to coordinate global policy on trade, health, climate, and other issues. Under G20, there are some working groups and engagement groups that will give policy recommendation for the government. Civil 20 or C20 is a part of the engagement group of the G20. The main theme of this year's G20 is Recover Together, Recover Stronger, which means that Indonesia encourage inclusivity to recover from the pandemic. In line with the G20's theme, C20's umbrella issues also highlight the importance of inclusivity, particularly in development sectors. So, what does inclusivity mean? How important it is? And how do we ensure inclusive development? Today's topic will talk about ensuring inclusive development through participatory approach. We will have two outstanding guests from Indonesia and India, Gilang and Prachi. Both Gilang and Prachi hold a master's degree from Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. Gilang is a co-founder of Participate, a development consulting that introduced the use of participatory approach in Indonesia, while Prachi is a co-founder of Evolverance, a social impact consultancy with a mission to foster NGOs towards sustainable solutions. Without further ado, please welcome Prachi and Gilang. Hey Prachi and Gilang, how are you guys today?
Hi, Anin. We are great.
And very nice and very happy to be here.
Oh, that's really nice to finally meet you guys. I'm very happy, actually. So basically, I did a bit of research, and about your organization, also your work. It's really wonderful. I've been curious about your work in inclusive development. Please tell me about your organization and what works you do.
Okay, let me start. Thank you, Anin, for the kind introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Gilang. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Participate. We are a development consulting firm specializing in participation. Basically, we are under the mission to democratize social change processes by re-highlighting and also reshaping the role of marginalized communities in the development sectors, particularly Indonesia, where we are operating. And in doing so, we are utilizing our collective experience in our team in various participatory approaches, like Anin said before, that include on program design, monitoring evaluation, participation strategy, reflective method through consultancy. And we also run the participatory action research education program, or the fellowship as we call it, that we run in Indonesia also. Aside of those consultancy and fellowship, we're also doing part projects, and as well as providing pro bono consultancy with CSO, particularly the one that are led and or focused on marginalized youth in Indonesia. And also, as Tim suggests, we are so excited to be here. Thank you for having us, and we are looking forward to share the insight on how we can use participatory approach to enable inclusive development. Back to you, Anin.
Thank you very much, Gilang. How about you, Prachi?
Thanks, Gilang. That was amazing. Hi, everyone. I'm Prachi. And as Anindya really shared that I co-founded Evolverance, which is a social impact consultancy. And Evolverance emerged from this idea that there are a lot of remote NGOs who do a lot of amazing work with core grassroots communities, but very less people actually know about them. And they are not able to garner as much support as is needed for their work. So Evolverance does not want to create a parallel ecosystem or a dependency, but Evolverance's model is that we go down to the grassroots, work with these community-based organizations to ensure that they are able to achieve their vision and mission and that their programs are sustainable. And one of the core things, the way we do and we operate is to really involve the community in solutionizing, because we believe that they know the challenge is best. And therefore, they know the solutions best as well. We just need to provide them with a platform. So we provide social impact consulting services, wherein it ranges from strategy making to creating an impact to fundraising to evaluating their impact. But all of this rests with a foundation of participatory research approaches, so that the NGO can actually build their capacity to understand how can they start doing it themselves with the support of Evolverance first. But as Evolverance takes a step back, they can actually sustain, so that we can transfer those skills instead of making them dependent on us and not create a parallel ecosystem. So currently we're working in remote rural Rajasthan, but we're equally excited to expand to other parts of India and really mainstream the process of participatory decision making, participatory action research, and involving communities in the decisions that impact their lives. And we believe that they do get to have a say in it.
Okay. Oh, wow, that's very, very inspiring. But today, when we talk about development, you guys, inevitably that we're gonna talk about SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals as well, right? We might say that SDGs is bridging between the goals of neoliberal capitalists and also social activists. Consequently, inclusive development gains more attention nowadays. How do you define inclusive development then?
Thanks, Anandya, for the question. So, at Evolverance, the thinking that we have about inclusive development is that for us, it simply translates to leaving no one behind, because no one deserves to be left behind. When we work in rural, remote Rajasthan, we're typically working with nomadic tribes who, through a lot of government interventions, they're perceived as criminals in the society. They're one of the most vulnerable communities. We've also seen that a lot of NGOs actually get a lot of, backlash when they work with many vulnerable communities because they're not in the majority. So they have very small pockets of communities. But we feel that, to build a sustainable world, you have to have no boundaries, and you have to break certain notions, and you have to unlearn certain things and relearn certain things. And I think the pandemic is a good example of that. It has actually um, definitely caused us a lot of suffering, but it has also opened our eyes to the way development work needs to be done, the amount of inclusivity, the amount of authentic listening, the amount of amplification of community voices that the world needs. And it has really shown us the stark inequality that exists, with a very small percentage of the world's rich having so much percentage of the entire world's wealth. And that's definitely not inclusive. So at Evolverance, we believe that to be able to achieve the SDGs, it's not the responsibility of just the governments or the responsibility of only philanthropists or just like that, but it's the responsibility of every single person, more so of these NGOs, in amplifying the voices of the communities. Because if it's not, it's like we're better together. Yeah. So if we are leaving no one behind is when we achieve this. And by leaving no one behind, I mean across domains. It's environmentally, it's economically, it's geographically, in every realm. When we don't leave anyone behind, when we are truly worried about being one global family more than do I have this or do I have that, that is when development is more inclusive. And it's about 100 people taking one step, and not just about one person taking 100 steps, because it's the more the better. So at Evolverance, that's what we are trying to bring: amplification to these community voices, going on the field, being more participatory in our approach, taking these voices to the global level, to the funders, to the other dignitaries who have more power and influence, and join and have them join the cause. Because that's when we become inclusive, when the most marginalized and vulnerable, who are impacted by the decisions that we sometimes very conveniently make, sitting very comfortably in our homes, when you involve them, that get impacted by these decisions, that's when we genuinely become inclusive. And would love to hear participants' thought and perspective on inclusive development.
Well, I think you sum it all. The explanation on this spot on, Prachi. But just to add, I think the way we see it as actually inclusive development is centered around the concept of inclusivity. That means allowing and accommodating people who have historically been excluded, whether it's because of gender, race, ability, sexuality, so that they can exercise agency and power for their life, right? And so inclusive development is centered around that concept. So that means acknowledging that the needs and the role of marginalized communities in the defining the direction and priorities of development. Because again, development is one of the sectors that actually focus on marginalized communities. But relevant to the G20 discourse, when we talk about economy and how we combine inclusive development and economy, but it's also the questions about how we can ensure that we not only have in economic growth, but also we're ensuring that the benefit of having them can be a benefit of all, without exceptions. So that's the operationalization and how we see the embodiment of no one leave no one behind, and also inclusive development. In participate, practically we see that when we talk about inclusive development, we cannot discuss about we should bring the talk about participation on that discourse. That means not only acknowledging that marginalized communities exist, but we also ensure the meaningful participation in the development is for them to be ensured that this happen. So inclusive development, asking the question, who is on the table, whose voice being heard, especially when we design development priorities and development intervention. So when we talk also about SDGs, it's not about leaving them behind, but also bringing them together and give them the space to actually take role on some of the processes that we have in defining the G20 priorities. SDGs priorities.
Yeah, that's really true. Like one of the keys of inclusive development basically is like participation, right? So because being inclusive means, like Gilang said, also like we listen to all voices, no matter what are their background, also where they belong. So how to ensure the implementation of participatory approach in inclusive development?
I think to answer this question, there are two layers, right? The one maybe more on a philosophical level, and the second on more on the practical level, what we do in participate. On more philosophical element, we need to understand that when we talk about inclusive development, we trying to democratize social change processes. So that means that the social change is not only owned by the one who has resources, donor funding, and everything that categorizes as resources, but also the one that also experience the problem. So in that context, on the philosophical element of the inclusive development, we need to ensure that the design, implementation, and evaluation of any development interventions need to take into account a degree of participation of marginalized communities. That's for sure. And on more tangible, on more operational aspect on how we actually operationalize the idea of inclusive development, in participate, we walk the talk of it by implementing participatory active research. Basically, is a tool. Sometimes people call it research, learning process, problem solving, but it's basically participatory and democratic process concerned for a betterment of human processes or situations. So we invite people who have a problem or experience the problem to co-design a solution together, so they can come up with a solution that actually fit for them. In participate, we always ensure that PAR is an integrated part of our intervention. Just the last project that we have is actually on acknowledging or actually evaluating and then understanding the lived experience of young funders during COVID, for instance. Why it matters? Because during COVID times, a lot of the conversation about resources is more targeted social enterprise, but sometimes the grassroots communities or even grassroots communities that led by young people is so already under resources. And sometimes we need to deep dive on what happened with them to understand their life experience. So we gathered around 6 young funders across Indonesia from the west to the east. And then we also try to understand their life experience during the COVID time. And then we come up with the practical solutions. That's how we do inclusive development. That's how we're trying to ensure that every voice is being heard. And then we take that into account into designing of a program or designing of policies. Back to you, Anin.
Yes, how about you, Prachi?
Thanks, Gilang. That was fantastic. Loved hearing about the project that you're doing. So very similar on the same lines as you totally agree with what you said. I feel that, to make development truly inclusive through participatory action research processes and power processes, one of the most important things is to reflect on one's own behavior. Because if we'll not reflect, we will not understand what is it that needs to change. So I think one of the key things that has come out in Evolverance's experience of implementing power-based projects is that we need to create a comfortable, safe, and a brave space for people to be able to truly reflect. And that is something that's come up in our work in rural Rajasthan, where we work with this NGO, and periodically we travel to their, on campus where they are located, and then we'll all come together. Over a period of time, it's taken us a few weeks and months of, multiple field visits to now have established a very strong bond of trust that they can open up about their challenges. They can, they can confide in us. So I think it's very important to create reflection spaces of beneficiaries or community based people, vulnerable groups, so that they are able to genuinely engage in self reflection, which and understand the levels of marginalization that they've faced. And this is for the grassroots. Similarly, for, let's say, funders or policy makers, the same kind of reflection is important, because they need to understand the multi-layered impacts of their decisions that are taken on these communities. So I feel that the bridge between these communities and these decision makers needs to be stronger, which is where power sort of comes in, where it can truly, create through human emotions and through certain activities which don't need to be very technical in nature, to really bring out, these questions that we can unlearn, be able to really question our own decisions, our own thought processes. So I feel one of the key things that needs to be done to implement power for inclusive development is definitely more time and space for reflection. And secondly, we also need to ensure that when we talk about power, it's not just tokenistic. That, for example, we've designed the entire project, and in the one last workshop we bring on the beneficiaries and we call that inclusive, right? Something Gilang also touched upon, that it needs to be an end to end, the entire journey from program design to implementation to, let's say, feedback, is everywhere you involve the beneficiaries. So Evolverance has just completed a participatory action research process where we worked across 10 settlements of nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes. We designed the project, collectively brainstormed with the NGO partner that we worked with. We co-designed the project, then we went on the field, we brought in the volunteers, we took their understanding, their opinions, we sort of refined some of our data gathering tools, we simplified some of them, we tried to, some of them couldn't read and write, so we did away with all the writing aspect of the tool. We only wanted them to tick mark on something or just draw something that could be easier. And once all of that work was done, is when we finalized it. Okay, this is what the project is seeking to achieve. And then we had multiple trainings. So as an Evolverance, it would have been very easy for us to go down into the field and collect the information that we needed, but that would have not served the purpose. So instead, we went for a training the trainers model, where we identified one community representative each. We trained them on why we are doing this, why is this important, what are the tools, and then they went and became mini facilitators in those 10 settlements and pockets. So they had that conversation with their community members where they have more trust, and they came back with relevant information. And then again, in terms of analysis also, we sat down together to analyze now what this information means, instead of Evolverance doing it and going back to them with, this is what it means. So we involved them in the analysis process, and so that it's not just tokenistic, but they genuinely feel involved, heard, belonged, and engaged. That's something that impacts their lives. And we've also been very honest in the way we've communicated to them. I think language also plays an important role. Also, there needs to be a lot of power transfer that when we do, because these community groups that we work with, they've been marginalized for so long that for them to actually get a chance to be heard, sometimes they're not able to speak up. Sometimes, they're not able to trust you enough to open up about their vulnerabilities. So the language that we used throughout the project was that, you know the problem, you know the solution, we are here to facilitate, but at no point is this me creating and you listening. It's us creating and us listening to each other. So that sort of made the project not very tokenistic. At least we tried our best to ensure it is not as it is as inclusive as possible. And lastly, we are now taking an extra step to create we are planning to host a webinar, because action research or power or inclusive development is useless if not actionable. It can't only be on paper, strategies and theories. So we're actually bringing all these people who participated in the research together with some external people from the sector, and having them present the work that they did so that they gain more confidence. They're able to really share the changes which happened. So yeah, self-reflection, non-tokenism, and truly being actionable, having some insights that come out of it, because we've seen frameworks made, we've seen theories being put together, but still the gaps and we're far away from the SDGs. So I think it needs to be equally actionable. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share for this one. Over to you, Ananya.
So, what kind of challenge actually when you're doing the project, when you're implementing the participatory approach in inclusive development so far?
So sure, I think from my personal evolverance angle, let me talk about the challenges that one can face in PAR when it's done in a face-to-face, in-person manner. And I'll request Gilang to cover the virtual aspect of challenges that come when you conduct it on a virtual platform. So for the challenges we faced when we went to the communities was, first, we were plain outsiders. They did not know who evolverance is, what is this participatory thing. Sometimes the development world can have a lot of jargons. So the one big challenge is trust. We have to build trust with the NGO partner. We have to build trust with the community. And I think at that level, we also need to be patient, because trust does not get built overnight. So it took us multiple calls, couple of field visits to go have the community members sit with us, get to know us, understand that this is what we want to do together with them, and not something that's not in their best interest. So one of the challenges comes is because the approach is very new in India right now. It's not one of the most popular approaches that gets used in the development world. So to mainstream that approach, one needs to have more resources for that approach. One needs to make those resources more contextualized, simplify them in the context that you're using. And the second is that you build a channel of trust, long lasting, long term trust with the community members, your research participants, the NGO partners or funding partners, whoever is it that you're working with. I think the third problem or challenge, I would say, I think it's power. It's a double-edged sword, not really a challenge. I think one can really twist it to work in your favor also, is to understand the amount of power you hold when you go and deliver that kind of a project. Yeah, it is sometimes very easy for the facilitator to guide and direct the entire flow of communication by way of you being a moderator or a facilitator. So it needs to have some unlearning, some losing the control, and really trusting the process. I think it's a human nature to be more worried about the outcome, but that's where PAR brings in that flexibility, that the process is what we need to focus on, and the outcome is something that when we devote ourselves to the process, just trust it and the outcomes will come. So not one of the challenges is being not being too fixed on the outcome, because sometimes we tend to do that. So with PAR, some typical research, one of the ways in which research generally flows is you have a hypothesis, you prove or disprove it. That's one of the most common economic research that happens. But with PAR, it's that the outcome that you have is vaguely defined, vision is broadly defined, but it's not that you're actively deliberately or intentionally molding your process to achieve that outcome. You're giving life to the process. And I think one last challenge is in terms of the language that you use, especially because we are working in the rural area. I'm well versed in Hindi and well versed in English, but that is not the language that is used in rural Rajasthan. So the language context is very important. A lot gets lost in translation. The words we use, I covered in the PowerPoint, but when it comes to your body language, when it comes to communicating. One of my personal recommendations from experience would be to have someone who's a local, who understands the context, who's able to really set in context and not bringing in the translator only during the workshop. Having the translator involved from end to end, again, from the design to the thinking, so that they exactly know what's happening, because then they'll be able to translate better, instead of calling the translator only when the workshop happens or only when you have a community visit, like that. So language plays a very important role. So being local is most important. And I think the very last one, and I'll request Gilang to sort of throw more light on it, is the fact that there's more need to mainstream our methodologies. It's unheard of, I would say. It is amazing and very life transformational from my personal experience. I think I've learned the most when I've tried to implement the projects and at a human level unravel layers of myself that I did not know I had while I was implementing these projects and engaging in self-reflection. But I think it's a beautiful approach that needs to be mainstreamed. More funders need to pull in money and become comfortable with having an iterative approach, which is not very fixed in nature. But that's extremely important that we mainstream it. And I would love to hear from Gilang some of the challenges they've been facing in their power projects.
Thank you, Prachi. I mean, in terms of, there are a lot of challenges, of course, because again, like Prachi has reiterated, that it is not a mainstream approach. So we are actually breaking some boundaries, breaking some procedure already in place when it comes to development practices. But we cannot deny first and foremost, pandemic does process a challenge for us implementing PAR. Why? Because actually the notion of having PAR is actually to have a direct interactions with the people who have a problems, right? And sometimes they are coming from marginalized communities that already has a constraint or have a limited access to infrastructure, to resources, right? So sometimes it's really hard for us to actually engage them when it comes to virtual, because again, sometimes internet connectivity is a problem, especially in the remote area. But also it's the question of whether we want to meet them, but also what does the risk that we bring when we met them in light of pandemic. So we are actually balancing that. In Participate, in 2021 at least, we focus our organization to try doing PAR virtually. And then there's a lot of challenges also happen on that. Like I mentioned before, the digital gap is really a problem that actually matters and importance to be highlighted. But also the balance of finding how can we get the most effective interactions, but also at the same time, PAR is also talking about building rapport, building engagement, right? Building communicative space, safe space. So sometimes it's really hard for us to balance that premises, because again, like Prati said, trust is what we need when we are actually doing PAR, because we need to ensure that every marginalized people or persons that join the space believe that the space is actually benefited them. So the trust is really important, and for us to get the trust, we have to build rapport. We need to make sure that the meaningful participation process happening. But again, when it comes to pandemic, when it comes to virtual, sometimes we need to balance that also with the effective time of us interacting with them due to the limitation of the infrastructure of the internet. The second challenge I would like to highlight also when it comes to how the future of adoption of PAR in the development sector. Like also Prachi mentioned before, PAR is not yet a mainstream approach. A lot of development practices still top-down mostly. What I mean by top-down is everything is predetermined, including the objective, the funding, the schedule, the outcome even. So sometimes it's, the flexibility is really hard. So first, yeah, in terms of challenging this status quo, having challenging the notion of flexibility of doing intervention is really hard, because when we discuss with a lot of development organizations, also in NGOs, we realize that sometimes funding comes with requirements, and sometimes it's schedule requirements, and also the activity that they need to be done. And every organizations that get funding need to follow that procedure, right? When the funder is not yet having the mindset of being flexible, being participatory, when it comes to the scheduling, to program design, it's really hard to match this expectation, because sometimes when we're doing PAR, we may have coming with a predetermined A as a problem, but sometimes when we unpack more of problem, maybe B is the problem or C is the problem. And sometimes that kind of flexibility is really required for our practitioners to be able to allocate resources to area that actually matters. And that's sometimes a challenge, because that's not always happening when it comes to funding. And second, also the notion of being really transparent with your intention. PAR is questioning who you are in the process. Like Prachi mentioned before, the outsider, insider, right? And we're also acknowledging that sometimes we bring value, we bring biases, we do have privileges that may affect the way we design the interventions. And the fact that PAR also asking us to design problem together with the one that has problem. So all the power relations, who we are, and then how it affects the relations between us and the marginalized communities. That's really hard, because sometimes people don't really understand that they do have privileges, especially when we design problems or we design projects, and that needs to be something that sometimes we try to highlight it to a lot of the development agencies, that the reflections matter when doing PAR. And the third is the notion of expert. This is what we also experience in participate, actually quite challenging to be tackled also, because we are getting used to the idea that the expert is the one who has higher education, maybe have more than like 15, 20 years of experience. But sometimes it's not always the case. When we talk about PAR, when we talk about participatory action reaches, it means that we talk about the lived experience of the one that has the problems. And then we assume that we believe that the one that has the problem is the one who are actually expert of the problem. So the expert definition is also the one that expert the problem is the expert. Sometimes really hard, because that means we trying to open a space for those people to be in the state of quote unquote expert that sometimes people not really comfortable with. It's not, I mean, I'm not trying to generalizing it, but sometimes that still happens. So PAR is trying to make sure that when we say about expert, when we say about data, is not always coming from those people, and that will be hard, because that means questioning how we validate the data, because currently development sector has already a certain set of indicators and ways of validation of data, and also how we verify the impact. Sometimes we always need external evaluators, right? The one who every expert on that sector to evaluate the effectiveness of the program. And then maybe that will be really big contrast with participatory MONE, for instance, where we ask the one that has the problems to evaluate an intervention that are delivered to them. So those are still a lot of work in progress, but participants see that there are also a growing aspirations for the development sector to adopt the participatory in more meaningful way, and we are really looking forward to have more in conversation and then advocating this to be happen as soon as we can. Back to you, Anin.
Okay, as you have already mentioned, both in Indonesia and also in India, the use of PAR is not mainstream enough, right? And then this year's G20's presidency brings the theme of recover together, recover stronger, which means that it's Indonesia try to bring inclusive development to the G20. So what do you wish for the G20 meeting this year related to inclusive development and also the implementation of participatory approach?
For participate, at least what we're trying always to advocate, we need to ensure that inclusivity is a priority in every government processes, right? But also not also define what does this actually mean for individual countries that are involved in G20 and also as a collective group. When we talk about inclusivity, what does it mean? But also the ask from us is we should also talk about inclusivity beyond G20. This should not be a topic that I'll discuss once a year. It should be a topic that we discuss year long, right? And also, again, back to the idea how we operationalize it. So we should not living inclusivity as a jargon, but we should make it more practical. That include open more space for marginalized community to be involved in the process, whether it's all G20 processes or after all the leaders come back to the country. Please open more space as possible so that marginalized community can be involved in every government aspect that also related to their life. And I would like to hear more also what Prachi have to say about this.
Very much on the same page as you, Gilang. It's my hope and wish, as Evolverance as well, that this is not a one-time conversation, that this is a continuous conversation that we revisit time and again so that we are able to really unpack what inclusivity means, because inclusivity can also be very contextual for different countries and in different parts of the world. For, it may require very customized approach of power to be implemented, very specific targeted decisions that need to be made. So definitely I would also urge, and it's my hope as well, that this is not just a one time conversation, something that we keep on doing very regularly till the time it is what we make mainstream, right? And would be very, very happy to also observe that this also opens up a space for authentic listening, where the ideas discussed are able to take a life of their own once the G20 is closed for the year at least. So again, linking it back to having life. So when we personally, with Evolverance, we really focus on authentic listening and listening to the voices of young people, marginalized communities, vulnerable communities. So really, how can G20 itself become more inclusive? Can G20 have a platform where the marginalized groups can come and represent their voices? How can that platform itself be used, not just in talking about inclusivity, but bringing marginalized groups, vulnerable people, giving them the platform of G20 and be inclusive both in thought and action. Yeah, so that is something that would be one of Evolverance's hopes, to really year on year find newer ways and newer means to be more inclusive, create spaces like Gilang was saying, to bring representation from those communities at the G20 itself and make them a part of the conversations is when we are truly inclusive. At the same time, like Gilang mentioned, unpack the term inclusivity and what it really means and talk about operationalizing it, talk about the challenges, talk about the messy things, because it's the messy things where things get stuck. And it's important for us to really unpack those challenges so that we can actually solve for them and work towards a more inclusive world where we are not years behind in our effort for SDGs, but really trailblazing and taking the lead in transforming the world one step at a time. So that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Wow, that's really, really great to hear from, like from Gilang, also from Prachi, for your work both in India and also in Indonesia. And that's all for today's podcast. I'm so glad that we have you guys today to get more understanding about your work in inclusive development and have different perspective in terms of the implementation of participatory approach in India and Indonesia. Thank you very much for today, Gilang and Prachi. And thank you for Insan Muda for listening to this special episode of Humanitalk podcast. Don't forget to share your kindness during Ramadan by scanning your QR code on your screen or transferring to the below account number. Wish you a good luck for both of you for your work, and also good day for you guys. Okay, bye. See you again.
Thank you, Anin. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.